I am pleased that Stephen Holmes has agreed to talk to us today. His topic is how liberal democracy did not last in Eastern Europe after the demise of the Soviet Union. In 2019, Stephen joined Ivan Krastev to publish the book, The Light That Failed: Why the West is Losing the Fight for Democracy, by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes. Ivan Krastev is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and is chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. Stephen Holmes is professor of law at New York University, NYU. In June 2020, The Light That Failed was the book chosen by my book club. Half of us were interested in the populist turn and rejection of liberalism by Hungary and Poland. The other half of us were more interested in Krastev and Holmes' detailed predictions for the future of Russia and China in world affairs. All members were in agreement that The Light That Failed is highly recommended and should be reading for all. It is now time to turn the webinar over to Stephen Holmes. Perhaps, Stephen, you can tell us a little bit about your co-author, the Bulgarian Ivan Krastev, before launching into your subject. Would you mind doing that?
I'd be very happy to, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to everyone who's joining us. Yes, so Ivan Krastev is much younger than I am, but we have been collaborating for maybe 30 years by now. He's a Bulgarian by birth, but has and saw the same thing we saw, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall, but from the other side. And the fertility of our collaboration was based on this common, well, a divided experience of a common event, you might say. And it was for this that we were very enthusiastic, both of us, in 1989, about the possibilities of democratization and liberalization in Central and Eastern Europe. So that's how our collaboration began. He is a very brilliant man. He's a regular columnist in the New York Times. He has published, I don't know, 7 or 8 books. This is the only one I think he's written together with someone. I think if you Google him, you'll find many really interesting articles. So that's at least a little bit of introduction about Ivan. I love Ivan, and we are very close friends. And the collaboration was a real collaboration. Every sentence was really, in a way, written by both of us. Okay, so now I can just begin, Don. I'll just say a kind of a summary of what the argument is. Okay, so we started out asking ourselves not only why liberal democracy was in trouble around the world and seemed challenged and was on the defensive, but why the part of the world where in 1989 liberal democracy seemed ascendant, seemed most likely to succeed, has turned out now to be, in a way, the first place where a xenophobic, nativist, authoritarian illiberalism has actually taken power. And we particularly focused here on Kaczynski's Poland and Orban's Hungary. So the question is, why did that happen? And it's important also because it seemed to have spread to the rest of the world, including in the rhetoric of some, well, not only, of course, European populists, but also in the United States. Certain ways of talking, certain illiberal trends seem to be echoing, as rather than our exporting liberal democracy to them, they seem to be exporting illiberal, anti-democratic tendencies to us. So there are 2 common claims, theses, for why this has happened. One is that it's a kind of, it's in the DNA of Central Europe, that it just is a return of the repressed. This is an area where fascism succeeded. Now it's just coming back. That, we feel, is a very inadequate theory for many reasons. One, just methodologically, saying that things are now because the way they are now, things are the way they are now because they remind us of the way they used to be, is not a good theory. And anyway, today's populism is really based on a kind of the grievances of aging populations, which is not at all what fascism was in the 1930s. The second theory is that it's economic inequality, and that, of course, is relevant. And so that certainly 2008 financial crisis, a kind of discrediting of Western elites. I think before 2008, many people in the world thought that American and European financial elites knew what they were doing, and then it became clear that they didn't, and that kind of created a kind of alienation from the liberal idea, certain kinds of liberalism, and particularly the liberalism that says there is no such thing as too much inequality. The idea that there is no such thing as too much inequality for a society politically, that seems to be a problematic view. Now, so that's true enough, but it doesn't really help us explain what happened in Poland and Hungary, primarily because Poland was economically successful, still economically successful, and Hungary is an economic basket case, and you have the same forms of populism. So the economic theory, while relevant, isn't decisive. And we looked at a different, looked at the thing from a different angle. And mind you, there is no single comprehensive theory of populism around the world that would include India and Turkey and Brazil and so on. But we kind of came up upon one idea, which we think of as an Ariadne's thread to take us through many of the variants of illiberalism. And in the book, we focus on Hungary, Poland, Russia, and the US, with a conclusion about China, which I could say something about if you're interested. Anyway, what we came upon as a clue to try to help us get our arms around illiberalism, the rise of illiberal politics, was a slogan being used very commonly in both Hungary and Poland, which was, "We don't want to be copies. We want to be ourselves. We're tired of being copies." And this, set off a light bulb in our heads, because if you think of democratization and liberalization as processes of imitation, then the reason why they may give rise to grievance, resentment, is almost obvious, because the relation between a model and a mimic, or the imitated and the imitator, is a hierarchical relation in which the imitated is recognized as superior and the imitator is recognized as inferior. And if you put countries through a process of obligatory imitation of Western models for a period of years, resentment is bound to occur, partly because it implies that what you're giving up, that is your own native, say, traditions, was worth much less. And what was worthwhile doing is becoming like someone else. Very hard to do and feel authentic. So that was in a way, the clue that set us off thinking about the role of imitation as a feature of democratization in post-communist societies that produced resentment and eventually a politics of grievance. So it was the imitation. I wouldn't say, I think it's wrong to think of it. It wasn't imposed. The US and the EU didn't go there. Well, the EU used conditionality, but it wasn't really imposed upon the Eastern elites. There were Eastern European elites, Eastern and Central European elites, who welcomed modernization through Westernization. They embraced it, but that fact didn't take away the moral ambiguity, because it was all happening under Western eyes. And when I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, and I noticed that when Westerners came often to Hungary and Poland during the 90s, it was as if, visitors at the zoo who are looking at the primates and they say, well, they sort of look like us, but they lack opposable thumbs, or maybe they lack the rule of law or something. It was a kind of condescending attitude, which rankled for sure, and produced some kind of alienation from it. Now, let me kind of explain some of the ways in which, from an experiential point of view, the language of liberalism proved very inadequate for describing the experiences of people who lived in the early decades of post-communism. So when the wall fell in '89, you had really icons of East European dissident movements like Václav Havel and Adam Michnik, who both of whom said repeatedly, we want to be a normal society. We want to be just like the West. We don't want any experiments. We've had enough of experiments, like socialism was an experiment. We don't want to do that anymore. Let's just become a normal capitalist democracy. However, if you introduce a fully worked out system that comes from another place into a country that has none of the preconditions for that, you're going to be performing an experiment. You're going to get some consequences that you didn't expect. And part of the reason I think we did not predict what was going to happen is because we didn't expect the resentment of imitation to occur, for example. But here's a kind of simple, there's a couple good, pithy, I think, ways of describing the inadequacy of liberalism. So when you create private property in a country where there is no private property, and you do it overnight, like in Hungary, what happens is that the managers of communist firms use the assets of their factory to buy. They use the assets of the enterprise to buy the enterprise for themselves personally. This is called wild privatization. You got a few people becoming immensely rich overnight, and other people who were their best friends being poor. So you had a society in which two friends who were very close to each other under socialism, and after 1989, one of them is driving around in a Mercedes, and the other can't afford a bus ticket, and one is eating at fish restaurants, and the other can't afford a piece of fresh fruit, and you can see why that would produce anxiety and anger. But the key here is that the liberal category, which is to identify abuses by power, is human rights, individual rights. But when you privatize the public patrimony of a country, like Hungary's had enterprises, they were property of the state, they didn't belong to any individual. So when you confiscated them, you didn't harm an individual. So individual rights doesn't identify who's harmed, and the liberal category of public patrimony is a weak one. And it doesn't really, and moreover, when an individual factory owner stole basically the industry, became a multimillionaire overnight because he was located in the right place, was clever, maybe ruthless, he consecrated that stolen wealth by calling it a right, property right. So the language of rights just didn't really help grasp what was going on. And now I'll give you another example, which I think is equally telling for the inadequacy of liberal ideas to the experience of the time. So in 1989, anybody who was there, and that's true in Russia too, but in post-communist society, the liberty that was most celebrated by people as having been won by the collapse of communism was the liberty, the freedom to travel. Not only the freedom to leave your country and to visit, go somewhere else, to emigrate if necessary, but the freedom to leave your country. Today, over the last 20 years, there's a demographic collapse in Eastern Europe. I think Romania lost, I don't know how many, 10 million Romanians are living abroad now. In Hungary, it's 1/10 of the population, mostly young people who did their education in Hungary, wanting to go somewhere else. Say you get a medical degree, and your hospitals don't work very well now in Hungary. You can go to Berlin, open up a practice, work in a hospital, have very good equipment, do a very good job in your profession. Your family grows up in a safe environment and a healthy one. You leave your country. So, but from the point of view of a Hungarian or any East European, you cannot any longer identify freedom with leaving your country, because it feels like a depletion. There's a demographic anxiety in these countries that their populations are shrinking. In fact, Central and Eastern Europe is the part of the world with the greatest shrinkage of population. And it feels like people feel like their country is disappearing out from under them, which is, of course, a problem that has many roots. But my whole only point here is that the liberal category, freedom, doesn't not only doesn't register that hurt and that anxiety, but actually, in a sense, turns people against it, makes people want to close their borders and not participate in the free movement of peoples, which is something that liberalism, of course, celebrates. Then there are many other things. From the point of view of the sources of irritation, I'll concentrate for a few minutes on the European Union and the accession process and so on. So what happened after '89 was that the elites, the reform elites in Hungary and Poland and other countries too, decided that the most important thing for them to do was to accept European norms and to try to build them into their legislation. Now, this had a couple problems, many problems. The first of which you can notice right away is that the EU was telling Poland and Hungary that they were becoming democracies. And while they were telling them that, they were also telling them, we in Brussels are going to write your laws. So you have to pretend to be a democracy, but that is to rule yourselves. But actually, we're going to tell you what laws you can pass and what you can't pass. So this produced a kind of, they are actually almost being asked to be phonies in a way. And then, of course, they had visitors from Brussels who told them, why aren't you really being democracies? So that was irritating. And in the process, in this whole process, the reform elites that were early on the most important actors in Central and Eastern Europe began to be viewed as foreign agents. There's a word for a liberal in Hungary, the word is a foreign-hearted person. You're a liberal, they say, oh, you're foreign-hearted, which means you believe in the West or something, or you want to make Hungary Western. So what happened is that these Westernizing elites, the liberal elites, who early on were the most prominent actors, dropped from their vocabulary all national symbols, all national heroes, all reference to national history, on the ground that that would not be useful in speaking to and selling their country to the European Union. And the consequence is that they left lying on the ground these sources of national feeling available for a counter elite to emerge, which is what happened, a counter elite mostly of rural origins, provincial origins, who picked up these national symbols and accused the liberal reform elite of being traitors and of selling out their country and of not appreciating what it was to be a genuine Hungarian or a genuine Pole. So these are the kinds of resentment also at that old elite, which were all voted out of office. They have virtually disappeared in both countries. The liberal elites are gone, fragmented. They have no power, no salient, no public status now. So that's a kind of this resentment at losing who we are, and it's a little bit like second generation immigrants, whose parents may try to adjust to the host society's norms, but the children see that they're not treated that well, and therefore develop a kind of antagonistic identity, fighting against what the parents were trying to adapt to, so refusing adaptation. Okay, so Don, could you tell me how much more time I have, or how you want to proceed? That's a kind of.
Oh, you got lots of time to go.
Okay.
It's, another 20 minutes or so.
Okay, fine. I wasn't sure exactly what you wanted me to do. So let me see if my oh yeah. So there are a lot of, there's so many other points here, and the book is I think, very rich, and we did win a lot of praise, let's put it that way, for the details of the book. So I would encourage any of you who are interested in any of this to take a look at it. So one also important source of these forms of populism is, and we were deluded about it, we didn't really understand it, but in 1989, the Polish elites, for example, all talked the language of liberal democracy. But actually, nationalism was a kind of silent partner in the anti-communist coalition. Because, of course, in Poland, unlike Russia, in Poland, communism was imposed by a foreign power. And so one of the things that's happened after 20 years is that the nationalist party within the anti-communist coalition has emerged. It wasn't spoken of in the 90s for a variety of reasons. One, it was not acceptable in the post-nationalist rhetoric of the European Union. But more important probably is that in the 90s, if you'll remember, the most well-known nationalist was Milosevic, who was conducting a brutal, and had been a communist, and was conducting a brutal genocidal or whatever, murderous war in the Balkans. So using nationalist language was not acceptable. So it was there implicitly. So you might say it just came out partly in reaction to the things that I was talking about. Let's see. Well, okay, so one of the, I mean, they're kind of wonderful examples of the way East Europeans felt inferior or felt looked down upon. There was a scandal throughout the region, really, that Nutella tasted different in Central and Eastern Europe because they were using inferior product to the one they sold in Western Europe. And when asked about it, Nutella, the firm, said, yes, that's true, but we're adapting to local customs or something, which was, I mean, it's a silly example in a way, but it reflects this feeling, this hypersensitivity being looked down upon. Okay, so let me, so that the first chapter of the book is, first large, is on Eastern Europe, and more or less I've explained what the thesis is. Now let me turn to Russia, since some of you are probably, I mean, we're all interested in what's happening there, and it's going on now, and this is it's a time when, you know, Putin plays a large role in our collective subconscious, I guess. So it's a different story in Russia because there were no elites that really sincerely tried to imitate Western democracy. They didn't mind faking it. After all, they had been faking communism for 20 years. So they found it pretty easy to fake capitalism and democracy. And anyway, they had I mean, that's one way to put it. You could also say they had an understanding of the democracy as basically a system by which an elite fools most people, takes power and makes ordinary citizens think they have some say in government, but they don't really. It's just run by an elite for the elite. And capitalism, more or less, they had also having been good Marxists, they understood what primitive capital formation was like, which is basically, in Marx, the origins of capitalism has to do with stealing. You know, Elizabeth, the Queen of England, ordered Sir Walter Raleigh and others to go out and steal Spanish bullion off Spanish ships, and that was used as the initial capitalization of the English economy. Anyway, so partly they were just being cynical. They were pretending. They wanted to send their kids to Western schools, so they had to kind of pretend they were becoming democracy. They never were. This was all just subterfuge, faking, I would say, not imitation. And so there was never any revolt against the attempt to imitate the West. But something happened after, well, they used democratic forms, I should say. That's also kind of interesting from the point of view of political organization, I would say, in the 90s, and from the 90s through 2011, 2012. they had elections, of course, but these elections were like, they weren't, in no way were citizens given any power to choose their governors. I mean, basically first Yeltsin and then Putin, there were no alternative candidates and no one else you could vote for. And basically voting was just a kind of call it a farce, but it was not a, wasn't really a serious event. At a certain point in the 90s, actually, they had very low turnout and at their elections. And then they realized that the reason when they did polls, did surveys, why people weren't voting, the answer was piva niet, I don't know, I mean, no beer. And so they started to give beer at the voting booths. And so people started turning up to vote. It didn't really make it a democratic system, as you well imagine. In any case, it was a system, the way it was used in Russia in the 90s and through the aughts was as a way of testing local cadres. So you have an election, and if there are some local officials who are able to stuff the ballots so that Putin gets 80% of the vote, and he gets a high turnout, and Putin gets most of the vote. So the local official who did that gets promoted. The local official who fails, nobody goes to the polls, he gets fired. So this is how democracy in quotes, functioned during that period. But then in 2011, 2012, there were huge protests because the legitimacy formula of the Putin regime was we rig the elections and you don't protest. Because there's a rising standard of living, we're allowing you to travel, other benefits, but we rig the election and you don't protest, and that's our legitimacy. But in 2011 and 12, people protested, well, as they're doing now, screaming Russia without Putin. Russia bez Putina is the slogan on the streets. So they, Putin in a way decided that this method of elections without choice, which is nice, in Russian it's very nice, it's vybory bez vybora, it's like elections without a choice, was not sufficient anymore to people. And they looked for new legitimacy formulas, one of which was seizing Crimea, of course, that was an important one. But when the Russians seized Crimea from Ukraine, something very interesting happened, which was that Putin gave a speech explaining why Crimea did not belong to Ukraine, in which he verbatim copied the language of the West, and I think of Bush. Anyway, the language of all Western leaders used to explain why Kosovo did not belong to Serbia. So it was an imitation, but it was an imitation meant as aggression and as sarcasm. Putin loves this. Putin has, I don't know if you caught that the other day when Biden reported that he had told Putin, I looked in your soul and you don't have a soul. And then Putin said, we understand each other perfectly. That shows that Putin likes to joke, basically. I mean, Putin is an odious person, but he does have some kind of ironic sense of humor. And when he's, one of his main goals in foreign policy is to mock the United States, mock the idea that the United States stands for human rights, mock the idea that the United States is a peaceful power, mock the idea that the United States is a exceptional nation and a model for others. So what occurred, and this aggressive imitation is a form of imitation. It's known, I mean, there are many forms of it. The Nazis, you probably know that, the Nazis used it by trying to replicate, they were copying British pounds and trying to flood Britain with fake pounds. It was imitation meant to be aggressive. So that isn't the same thing I'm talking about here, but it's a form of aggressive imitation. So imitation can be defensive and aggressive. And Putin turned to a very offensive kind. And he's done this throughout. Everything the Americans do, he does it back. And he thought the Americans had interfered in the election in Russia. So he was doing it in 2016 as retaliation. And there are a whole list of other things, how they fly their airplanes near our coast, because we do that too. we've put, a certain number of Russians, banned them from traveling. He's done that to Americans. There's all this. But it's basically throwing it back in our face. It's a mirror. It's Putin's mirror. He's like, look at this. Look at yourself in this mirror. You're not as great as as you think you are. You're pretty bad. And anyway, we can talk the same way you do. So now there's a problem with that, which is why is he doing it? And what benefit do you get by exposing American hypocrisy to the extent that there is such a thing, which there is? But he doesn't. And it's in a way, he's not making his country better. He's not improving the conditions of his country. There's 50,000 kilometers less road today in Russia than there was when he took power. He's like, the country is falling apart. The Chinese are corrupt, but they build things, while Russia is corrupt, doesn't build. Anyway, that's kind of sort of summary of a few points about Russia, which we can talk about if you'd like more, because I'm following, of course, what's happening to Navalny these days, and the obvious change in administration's attitude. The last chapter is about Trump's America, which is now not really in the rearview mirror, but it's still there. But we're certainly living with it in the atmosphere. So the unusual thing about Trump, make him, I think, an extraordinary president. There's never been anyone like Trump, mostly because he is the first president who did not say that America is a moral model for the world. He basically, and America has a teachable idea. Trump's whole background, and this was true already in the 80s, he was never interested in the Cold War, but he was very angry about Japan and Germany for selling cars to Americans. So you probably know this, that the post-war settlement, one of the goals of the post-war settlement with the Japanese and Nazi powers, one of the ideas was that we must prevent the remilitarization of Japanese and German nationalism. And therefore, to prevent that, we're going to promote the industrialization of Japanese and German nationalism. We're going to channel German and Japanese creativity into replicating our own export-led industrial economy, which they did enormously successfully. Incidentally, part of the big plan was not to allow Germany and Japan to have nuclear weapons. That was like in people's mind, as for good reason. Anyway, this industrialization of Japan and Germany really irritated Trump. He was like furious at it. He said, why are they selling us? We beat them in the war. Why are they selling cars here? So being imitated. So while in Eastern Europe, the imitator felt aggrieved by the imitated. In Trump's America, or in Trump's case, the imitated felt aggrieved at the imitated. So it was a kind of reversal. And of course, playing into this is the idea that Reagan had, for example, that America is a beacon to the world and is a magnet for people to come here. As you know, what is the great slogan you hear in riots around the world? Yankee, go home and take me with you. So there's a kind of magnet to America, which was something many Americans are proud of, being able to bring people from all over the world. And Trump is obviously on a different planet from that. He thinks that the fact that we're attraction is bad. Now, actually, we're going to see that now that Americans are vaccinated, the consequence for the southern border are going to be difficult, because people are going to be running not just from poverty and violence, but for their lives. So this great success we're having with vaccinations is going to have a problem there, which is related, I think, quite clearly to the Trump phenomenon. Then, okay, so finally, I know I'm going on here, but let me just, so we end with, neither of us are experts on China, but there is a kind of very important, something very important happened in 1989, not just in Europe, but also in China, which is Tiananmen Square. And on Tiananmen Square, the students and the workers who were protesting against the regime built the Statue of Liberty, goddess of democracy. And Deng Xiaoping And they shut it down, they tore it down on the grounds that those students were imitating the West. And China has to develop without imitating the West. That was a kind of turn against the imitation imperative, which was, well, in many post-communist and of course in colonial societies as well. That's an important ingredient in political development. And today, one way of thinking about how do we think about the new conflict, which is definitely developing, has developed, it's going to develop more between the U.S. and China, and it's a big one. It's an important one, and it has this ideological point that is before the rise of China, we would be pretty safe in associating liberal democracy with economic prosperity. One thing that the China rise has disproved is that there's any need for a country to be a liberal democracy to develop economically and to pull hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. So that's a challenge, but it's not exactly an ideological challenge. You know, Mao's China was really trying to export peasant revolutions to Africa. What Xi Jinping's China is doing is exporting surveillance technology to people so they can catch their dissidents and things like that. But that's not an ideology. Chinese today aren't really trying to, first of all, they don't think anyone else can be Chinese, so they don't think anyone else can imitate their culture. They want relations that are functional, they want a friendly environment and so on, but it isn't a renewal of the Cold War in this sense, because it's not an attempt of two powers to create replica regimes around the world, which was basically what the Cold War was about. Okay, I said a few things, maybe some of it was interesting or raises questions. So tell me.
All was interesting. All was well explained, well spoken, and truly enjoyable all the way through from Poland to China via Trump in the middle there. I just wanted to start the questioning, if I may, with this newspaper of yesterday, talking about Poland in particular. And in the text for this essay, which is on two women who escaped from Poland because of the anti-whatever biases that they were suffering from. And there are two little statements in this newspaper I'd like to read. One is that Poland now ranks as the most homophobic country in the European Union. It goes on to say, homosexuality has long been taboo in Poland, where the Roman Catholic Church, which plays a prominent role in the country's social and political life, has worked hand in hand with the government to promote a conservative way of life. Now, Stephen, I don't know whether you wanted to avoid the church or not, but that's certainly
it's very Poland. You can't avoid it.
Poland center in this article of yesterday. So I thought I'd risk it by asking you about.
Oh, it's very good. No, of course, Poland, the church is a very powerful force, and you know, of course, that they do not basically recognize Francesco as Pope. They don't like Francis. For them, is not a Pope. He's a Argentinian, and he's a liberal. He's not a traditionalist Catholic. So there's that church in Poland. The church is a very nationalist organization. It's like Polish nationalism. It's not universalism. And of course, the Universal Church is in Africa, is universalist. So, and is much more liberal than the Polish church. So that's the first thing to get out. But I think this business of the anti-gay, anti-LGBT, emphasis on regular family relations in which women are subordinate to men. So you have a sense of traditionalism. Partly it's anxiety about change. Partly it's a demographic thing. There's a kind of fear that we won't reproduce anymore if we are all homosexual or something like this. This part of it. But I don't know. It's a very deep, and you find this, say Bolsonaro in Brazil has the same kind of violent homophobic rhetoric and violent action. Also in Poland, I read that article. people being beaten up sometimes and pushed around. Russia, of course, it's hard to, in Russia, I don't understand it because Russia was never really Christianized as a society. It's not a prudish society at all. Poland has something else there going on because it was highly Christian, obviously. But the homophobia is very striking. And of course, it is the form of, this is what you're doing in the West. This is a sign you are decadent. This is a sign you are trying to cut us off from our traditions. So now its relation to Catholicism, Catholicism, I was brought up as a Protestant, so I'm speaking as an outsider here. But of course, I know something about Catholicism. Catholicism is a very flexible religion. It has adapted to things over the years and adapts in some countries. Fine, there was liberation theology in Latin America and so on. So this is a variant. I think it has more to do with the particular moment and these anxieties, particularly the anxiety about people leaving the country. There's a demographic collapse because kids aren't having children. They're starting to have children later. This is happening everywhere. And in Poland, they're all moving away. There's 2 million Poles in London, I think. Something, or not 2 million, can't be. But there's basically, Poles are really leaving the country because of opportunity. So there's a fear of a country that's not reproducing itself. I'm sorry, I wish I could, I think this is a very good question, and it's psychologically one of the most profound. And you notice that if you have any conservative person, like say Dick Cheney or Gorsuch, anyone who has a gay person in their family suddenly becomes pro-gay, with no problem. So is it really related to an ideology? It's some kind of pose, but it's very violent. And I think what's most disturbing about that article and other things you read is the cruelty. I mean, whether or not you can not like LGBT, I don't really care, or transgender, but the cruelty, what is that about? Why do people want to, torment these young people this way? And I find it really hard to take. I don't have a good explanation, but I would say you're the hero of this exchange because you brought up a very good question about that.
For that. The other side of this argument is, according to the Pew research a year ago, Poles are the most pro-European Union of all.
Pro-Europe.
Pro-Europe.
Not European Union.
Yeah.
They want to be, okay, so that's another problem, an interesting one.
It's yeah.
So if you read, Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon, he also talks about how, North African countries shouldn't imitate Europe. We're not European. Don't try to make us become European. We are authentically ourselves. The Poles always thought they were European. So when the EU came along and says, you must become European, it was insulting to them because it's like, now we know what Europe is like. So what you find today, although it used to be that Europe was divided between the free world and the communist bloc, today it's divided in a different way, which is Western Europe has become very ethnically heterogeneous, which Eastern Europe was before Stalin and Hitler, while Eastern Europe has become ethnically homogeneous. So I have a friend, Jacques Rupnik. Rupnik is a brilliant French social scientist. He went to Poland, and there was a kind of a holiday resort full of Germans. He said, why are you here? We want to be with white people like ourselves. Really? And Poland, the Poles say, we are now the authentic Europe because we're white and Christian. You've got a bunch of Muslims. You've got a bunch of Black people. You're becoming greater Middle East and greater Africa. And we don't want anything to do with that. We want our own babies. There's actually an American politician who said that too. But Orban said, you can't make a country without your own babies. And why are we having and of course in Hungary and Poland, there are no immigrants, there are no foreigners, there are no Muslims, there's nobody, but they have this language and then they brag about that. So it's partly, we are pro the Europe that we want. You see, it's not we don't want to be part of this Europe, which is letting in migrants, in which, by the way, my son, I have an Italian son, who works for Caritas, the Catholic charity. That's all they do. They take care of migrants. And it's like we're helping them get jobs, helping them, get fed. So this Catholic Church here in Italy is not anti-migrant and chauvinistic and white supremacist and all that, but in Poland it is. So I think they love a Europe, an idea of Europe, which is they no longer see in the West, and they don't go. But there's, I said, 1 million Poles in London, and they're on WhatsApp with their friends, and the Poles in London live in the same neighborhoods as the Muslim migrants and so forth and so on. So they're competing for the same. So they have a sense of the multicultural, multi-ethnic condition of the West, probably an exaggerated one, which they absorb from their friends in the West. And then it creates this idea, well, we want to be in Europe, but we want to be in a Europe that used to exist. I mean, it's a problem to have an ideal that's a real country. The communists had an ideal that never existed. So that was fine, that never changed. But the Easterners had an ideal which really existed, the West, under communism. But naturally, when communism disappeared, the West started to change. It did. So all of a sudden, their ideal was no longer the West that they wanted to belong to, was no longer the anti-communist West, for example, because there was no communism to fight. And it was no longer so mono-ethnic and monocultural. Was that adequate? Yeah.
Thank you for that. Tyler Beebe asks the question, to what extent are the same anti-liberal attitudes that prevail in Hungary and Poland prevalent in Ukraine? How do you interpret Putin's recent troop buildup and subsequent whatever he's doing at the moment? We're not quite sure.
Yeah, it was a feint. He's bullying. He's trying to throw his weight around, trying to be relevant. He's in a lot of trouble at home, as you know, not just because of Navalny and so on, but the bloom is off the rose, and he's not been taking care of the country. But Ukraine, of course, has many regions. The far west, there's very right-wing nationalist movements that have a kind of fascist flavor to them. On the other hand, Ukraine is not going to develop except in the Donbass and in the eastern region, which is more or less under Russian separatist control. The rest of the country is not going to talk in an anti-Western way because they depend on, they're just hoping to be saved by the West right now. I would say if the Russian threat disappeared, you would find very strong nationalist, xenophobic, Ukrainocentric kinds of movements. I don't know, majority, maybe some number, 30% of the population around Lvov in the western portions of the country. But I interpret this, I think Putin is mostly in trouble. He's searching for something, and it's worrisome. He might do. On the other hand, he does. He went into Syria. He killed lots of people. They bombed hospitals. They did terrible things in Syria. For what? What did Russia get out of it? They had a port already. They weren't going to lose their port. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of discontent with this adventurous now. And, so we're going to see the big weakness.
Mal, you're always poised with a question or two. Have you got one for us at the moment?
I do. I'd like to do one that's a follow-up to Tyler's question. Charlie Kimball asked the question, what would be the impact of Russian attack on the Ukraine on the various European entities that you've talked about? Would they stand up and say something, or?
No, Europe is a military pygmy, of course, partly because it's been under an American umbrella and they don't spend, Germans don't spend, and we didn't want Germans to spend. We didn't want Germans to become a formidable military power that could send its troops all over the world. So that was planned. It's going to change now for sure. We just definitely don't want the Germans to get a nuclear weapon. That may change too. No, the Europeans aren't going to react. No, we're in awareness, and the US is not going to react militarily either. I mean, they can have sanctions. I think the one anti-Russian thing that could happen if Russia did that is to break off the building of Nord Stream, the oil pipeline under the sea that is bypassing Poland and going straight to Germany, which is a kind of prize project of Angela Merkel. And but particularly if the Green woman becomes chancellor, well, that may be, I don't know if it will be done, but that's something they could stop Nord Stream. That's an American wish. They shouldn't. We don't want them to do that. That is, our government, both Democrats and Republicans, don't want them to do that. But there's no chance of a military action any more than I mean, just think where is something that these two great rivals can do that would cause us to react militarily? Hong Kong, we did nothing, basically. And Hong Kong was like Eastern Europe. They were waving American flags, nothing. Taiwan, I don't know. That's the big question is Taiwan. I do feel like there's something eerie about the Russians and Chinese working together and having these parallel threats on Ukraine and Taiwan, kind of trying to test our resolve to resist and do something. And I don't know. Taiwan probably, that would be bloody. That would be bloody. So I don't know.
Now, and I wanted to ask a question of my own, and that really goes back to Steve's basic premise about the essentially porting a veneer of liberalism on an area, on a series of countries that for at least generations lived under authoritarianism. We in the West keep talking about what we did, but what little I understand of history, we struggled for a long time, and whatever form we have today emerged in England by the charter. By the French did their own version. We struggled and continue to struggle. And we assume that we can apply what we have learned and what we think we're practicing on societies that never had it, don't understand it, may not be capable of dealing with it. Is it just the misperception that we have?
No, that's very good, Mel. I think it's a good distinction between production technology and interaction technology. So you can unplug a refrigerator in one country and plug it in another. It'll still work depending on the current, but more or less it's the same. But something like democracy, because there was a illusion, particularly, and you see this in the Iraq War, for example, too, that a country after a 6-month military campaign, you can go into a country in which 75% of the people marry their first cousin. I don't even think West Virginia is like that. It's like really a very different culture, and impose democracy on them you can't do that. And there are no political parties. A democracy, we saw that now on January 6th. Democracy depends on the fact that the loser you have competition between two groups. They have to be organized. They have to have public support. They go off to an election. The one who loses peacefully leaves office. And after leaving office, doesn't lose that much. Doesn't go to jail. Doesn't have all their property taken away. That is unbelievably hard to create. So what happened in a place like Iraq was people mistook the absence of obstacles for the presence of preconditions. That is, Saddam was an obstacle. You get rid of him, and then they thought democracy was going to come out like toast out of a toaster. But that's not the way democracy develops. As you said, it's centuries. It takes a long time. There are many preconditions. And for God knows, the United States had in the late 18th century, had a situation that no other country in world history had, which was you had this coastline of 3 million people or so, European technology and knowledge and so on, and this vast fertile land, which was open to development. No other country has ever had such a thing. And you can't just say, okay, let's take the American system and put it someplace else. Well, that's not possible. It's really lack of thinking about conditions under which things occur. I mean, it doesn't mean that determinism, but it means you can't borrow a worked out model from one place and plaque it on to some other place. You're going to always come out with something you didn't expect, and probably perverse effects.
Back to you, Don.
Well, one of the questions that's come up, which is sort of off in the distance, is, but China did copy the West in co-opting capitalism in Hong Kong, for example,
Yeah,
even though it was compartmentalized from the rigid autocratic system that prevails. And I wonder, actually, a number of the questions are referring to the idea of copying and,
good, excellent.
resisting.
I mean, of course, copying, perfect. Copying is universal. It started out, the Romans in whatever it was, 400 BC, sent a group over to imitate Athens, and they brought back models and so on. So imitating other countries is but the point is you can import a model, but you can't export it. It is if you can take a foreign model and pick parts of it and adapt it to yourself, make it kind of work. You can certainly adapt technology. So capitalism and like industrial organization. There's a very important essay, fantastic, in 1911 by the great sociologist Thorsten Veblen. And what is it called? But it has the following claim. He says, the Japanese are borrowing Western technology, but they're keeping their culture. So I predict that in 40 years, they're going to attack us with our technology. It was 1911. It's like, and the Chinese, of course, have taken American technology easily, also architecture, things that are formal, but they're resisting the Chinese mainland. I'm not talking about Hong Kong here, and resisting the siren song of the West. But yes, Hong Kong is a city-state, highly subsidized in a particular environment, incubated by Great Britain, taken care of by an imperial power. It was actually an enclave of the British Empire, as opposed to being a self-standing democratic system. And it was selective. They developed things. Human beings are capable of adapting. I'm not a determinist. They used to have things like, the Asians can never be capitalists. I was like the stupidest idea ever. Or they can't be. I mean, India's culture's relation to politics is to underdetermine it. So Germany has had more or less the same culture under the Kaiser, under Weimar, under the Nazis, under the Bonn regime. So it's German culture, but the politics is totally different. So a culture can tolerate different political forms. So I'm not being deterministic, but just copying, and it isn't. I mean, I don't deny that even sometimes copying can succeed. But what I'm pointing out, and I think we're pretty strong ground on this, is that it produces a lot of resentment in people, particularly the ones who don't make it. The word that is most negative in Hungary today is meritocracy, because it means you're measuring us by your criteria of merit. You're telling us we have no merit. You're insulting us. They kicked out Central European University from Budapest,
yes,
because it was the best university in Hungary is a Western university. And it's like, what are you telling us, that we can't have a good university? So there's this kind of resentment. But yeah, everybody copies. There's a great, what's his name? The great French sociologist, Gabriel Tard, wrote a book, Imitation. And basically he says society is imitation. So imitation is everywhere. But there is a way where you imitate someone, and if you can't get him out of the way, he's an obstacle to you. Makes you feel like lesser. And it does produce certain kinds of resentment, and that's more or less the point we were trying to focus on.
I would like to get back for a moment to hard politics, if you like.
Okay.
And in particular, the politics of Hungary. And Prime Minister Orban now rules by decree, I understand. And the only way that he can be relieved of that power is if there's a 2/3 vote in their parliament. And at the moment, he, according to the New York Times is my Bible, he is eroding the press freedoms, undermining education, and limiting judiciaries. Now, I don't see the merit in why he is running backwards with some of these progressive things.
Well, it's
such as education. Why education?
Yeah, you would think. He really gives, his big problem now is that young people are leaving the country and he's not really helping them. So the Hungarian situation has many components. One, unlike Poland, it's a kleptocracy. Kleptocracy means Orban and his friends are the richest people in the country. They're just like stealing the country blind. Some of the people who are the liberals who are there leaving, he likes them to leave because it leaves him unchallenged. He is not just doing the things you say, weakening the judiciary and the press and so on, but George Soros, who is a Hungarian, and Jewish Hungarian, there was a period there where the buses in Budapest had Soros's picture on the floor of the bus so you would step on it in order to say the Jew. And this line, remember in Charlottesville, this is a kind of interesting universal thing. The Jews will not replace us means, and that's very common in Hungary, the Jews have a conspiracy going on in which they're trying to bring Muslims and Mexicans and Africans and foreigners and ruin our country. So when it says Jews will not replace us, it doesn't mean by Jews, it means by others. By, in this case, in Charlottesville, by Mexicans, and in Budapest, by Muslims, others who are going to take over Hungarian culture. So there's anti-Semitism and cruel. He shut down the women's study program in all the universities because he said it's teaching girls not to have babies. It seems like crazy, but anyway, that's what he said. And they are, of course, they had a constitutional majority. In Hungary, it's done. That's just an authoritarian regime. Poland, it's still not there quite, but it could get there because there are some foreign-owned newspapers. There's some space. In Hungary, he controls everything, and he did it by capitalist means. That is what they monopolized all the money. Then he and his friends bought all the newspapers. So private. They didn't censor. It's not like there's this bureau of censorship of the state telling you what you can print. No, he and his friends bought all the press and control all the TV by legitimate means. That is, they bought them. And they control all the theaters and basically everything's in their hands because they don't want anyone exposing their corruption. That's why they're doing it. If you say, why are they doing it? Because educated people, a court, a newspaper, they would look into things and they would expose their corruption. So none of that can happen. And it's not ideological, really, although he makes populist appeals. He says, we have to return to the Carpathian Basin in 1100 and be the authentic Hungarians of 1100. How he would know what that was, I can't imagine. But I think there, a lot of the illiberal, because liberalism, I mean, it could be also it can have some downsides, but it means you can criticize government. And if you have, I think of downsides because there are a lot of people who don't want to get vaccinated, but are suspicious of government telling them to do that. But no, he's aware if Hungarians were able to look at what he was doing, they wouldn't like it. So he's not going to allow them to.
Yeah. A question from Henry Stanton is, you have talked about the southern tier. You have not talked about the southern tier, Yugoslavia and the Czech Republic, for example.
Well,
now, the Czech Republic has been in the headlines recently because of expulsing a whole bunch of
Russians. Diplomats. Yeah, the Czechs are very anti-Russian. That's deep. Of course, Pole too. Hungary less so. I spent a lot of time particularly in the Balkans in the 90s. It's I think there's they're suffering a lot now with COVID, of course. I also read something recently about the Czech Republic. The Czechs were very much, you're right, and Václav Klaus, who was the first prime minister after '89, was an adamant Westernizer. So much so that when Czechoslovakia split into two countries, one idea for renaming the Czech Czechia was to call it East Germany. But that didn't go over too well with people, but they wanted to be part of that world. I think very similar things. Yeah, I can't say much. I haven't really followed it closely recently, but it isn't dissimilar. The population is collapsing, and the economies are not doing well, and all of them have done poorly. There was a period where Slovakia had a liberal leader, a woman. She's now been thrown out. So I would say ceteris paribus, just the analysis is similar. Certainly in the 90s, they were big on copying. And certainly part of the reaction against it was the same. I don't have any recent updates about the Czechs.
A personal comment I'd like to make before we end is that a few years ago, my wife and I spent a week or more in St. Petersburg in Russia. And while we were there, I kept asking to go to some of the museums where what I call tractor art from the communist days was being exposed. And no matter where I went, Hermitage or anywhere, all those wings were closed. There's no doubt about it. And the whole effort that we were propagandized with was back to the days of the Tsar and the palaces and the splendor of those times. And I try to translate that horizontally to Putin, for example.
Well, he built a palace. Yeah, sure. He wants to be a czar. No, but you're very right. So this is interesting. 2017, you probably noticed, or maybe you didn't, there was no celebration of the revolution. Why? Because the revolution was regime change, which they're against. So they're all, and they're very unsure about 1917 and communism really, getting rid of the authority, is that really a good idea? Having people on the streets, I don't want to do that. It's a very elitist society, of course, and the Gini coefficient is huge in Russia. There's a few rich people, but so there's this nostalgia for the czars, and there was a big exhibition a couple years ago on the Romanovs, and it was something like 300 years of, as if they were still in power, the Romanovs. That's kind of it's a populist appeal to people who like to dream about Russia at one time. But Putin himself, I don't think there's like basically anything he believes. He's not really a nationalist either. He's a Soviet person, and he's also very corrupt, of course, and cruel. So, but I think you're right that the Russians struggling with their memories. Just one last thing on Petersburg and memory. There's a great book published in France by Marquis de Custine called, I think it's Voyage en Russie, 1820. And he went to Petersburg, and he said two things: that when you're going through customs to enter Russia, you feel like you're being indicted for a crime, which I think that's like reminiscent of the. And then he asked people to tell him, what is this building? Who built that building? When was it built? What happened? And no one wanted to tell him. No one told him. And his theory was, these buildings have seen such cruelty that everyone wants to forget. It was pretty evocative. So there you are.
Thank you, Stephen. The audience doesn't know that you flew to Europe over the weekend.
I did. I arrived here last night. Yeah.
We still got you on your New York time, probably. So we've done very well. Your jet lag hasn't affected you in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I don't know about that. Maybe if you didn't see it, that's good.
Anyway, you're enthusiastic and alert and informed, and we love you dearly. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand you back to Mal, who's going to close up this enterprise of ours, and you can go and have your glass of wine, and so will I. Take care.
Many thanks to our distinguished guest, Stephen Holmes. Thank you to Don, today's recruiter and moderator, to Joan Kuhn, her colleagues at the Chappaqua Library, Carrie Krams from Newcastle Media Center, and all of those of you who joined us from wherever it is you're joining us from. Let me remind you that in 3 weeks, on May the 17th, we will be hosting, for the first time visit, retired Professor Lawrence Wilkerson, whose topic will be the warfare state, If you have friends and family who would like to join us, please email Joan Kuhn, JKUHN @WLSMAIL.org so that we can add you to our list, both for programs and for the newsletter, which will start up again in late May between series. Until we meet again on May the 17th, please be safe.
Stephen, Mal, all of you, take care.
Thanks.